Some people believe that silence equals weakness. They mistake composure for cowardice and discipline for fear. Marcus Thompson was one of those people. Standing 6 feet tall with arms covered in tattoos and a reputation for never backing down from a fight, he had spent most of his adult life proving his dominance through intimidation and violence. But on a cold Tuesday morning outside Buckingham Palace, Marcus would learn that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who never raise their voice, never flex their muscles, and never need to prove anything to anyone. What happened next would be captured on dozens of phones, viewed by millions online, and become a masterclass in why you should never underestimate someone simply because they choose to remain calm. The morning fog hung low over London as tourists began gathering outside the iconic gates of Buckingham Palace. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a 32-year-old construction worker from Birmingham who had driven down to London with his girlfriend Sarah for what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway. Marcus had a different idea of romance than most people. For him, showing off his strength and dominance was his way of impressing Sarah, even if it meant causing trouble wherever they went. Marcus had been drinking since early morning, starting with a few pints at their hotel bar before making their way to the palace. The alcohol had amplified his already aggressive personality, and he was looking for any excuse to demonstrate his toughness. Sarah walked nervously beside him, recognizing the signs that her boyfriend was about to cause a scene. She had seen this behavior countless times before, and it always ended the same way. The couple approached the palace gates where a small crowd of tourists had gathered to take photos and watch the famous Queen's Guard on duty. Standing perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat was Guardsman James Mitchell, a 28-year-old soldier who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been protecting the royal family for over 3 years. James stood at attention with his rifle at his side, his eyes focused straight ahead as he had been trained to do. Marcus noticed the guard immediately and felt an overwhelming urge to test him. He had heard stories about these guards and how they were not allowed to move or speak while on duty. To Marcus, this seemed like an invitation to have some fun at the soldier's expense. He nudged Sarah and pointed toward James with a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Watch this," Marcus whispered loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "These toy soldiers aren't allowed to do anything. They just stand there like statues no matter what you do to them." Sarah grabbed his arm, tried to pull him away. "Marcus, please don't. Let's just take some pictures and go. We're supposed to be having a nice day together." But Marcus shrugged off her grip and began walking toward the guard. His movements were deliberate and aggressive, like a predator stalking its prey. The other tourists sensed the tension building and began pulling out their phones, some hoping to capture a harmless interaction for social media, others sensing that something more serious was about to unfold. Marcus stopped directly in front of Guardsman Mitchell, close enough that the guard could smell the alcohol on his breath. James remained perfectly still, his training taking over as he focused on maintaining his composure despite the obvious threat standing before him. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this man felt different. There was a violence in his eyes that suggested he was looking for more than just a reaction. "Look at this guy," Marcus announced loudly to the crowd that had begun forming around them. "Dressed up like he's in some kind of costume party. But he's never seen a real fight in his life." The insults continued for several minutes as Marcus circled the guard like a shark, looking for any sign of weakness or reaction. He made faces, waved his hands in front of James's face, and continued his verbal assault. James remained motionless, his breathing controlled, and his mind focused on his duty. He had been trained to endure much worse than the taunts of a drunk tourist. But Marcus was growing frustrated by the lack of response. In his world, when you challenge someone, they either fought back or backed down. The guard's complete lack of reaction was something he couldn't understand or tolerate. The alcohol in his system was making him more aggressive by the minute, and the presence of the crowd was feeding his ego. "You think you're tough, standing there with your little toy gun?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "I've knocked out guys twice your size. You wouldn't last 5 seconds in a real fight." Sarah was now crying, begging Marcus to stop and leave the guard alone. Other tourists were becoming uncomfortable and starting to back away, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond harmless fun. A few people had already called the police, but it would take several minutes for them to arrive. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, starting to record a video. "I'm going to make you famous, toy soldier. Everyone's going to see what happens when a real man comes up against one of the Queen's little dress-up dolls." He held the phone up close to James's face, filming himself as he continued his taunts. "Say something. Do something. Or are you too scared to move? I bet underneath all that fancy uniform, you're just a scared little boy playing soldier." The crowd was now completely silent, watching in horrified fascination as Marcus's behavior became increasingly aggressive. Even other tourists who had initially found the situation amusing were now uncomfortable and moving away from the confrontation. James remained perfectly still, but inside his mind he was calculating. He was assessing Marcus's stance, his balance, his positioning, and his level of intoxication. James had been trained not just in ceremonial duties, but in combat techniques that had kept him alive during his military service in some of the world's most dangerous places. He knew that if this situation escalated to physical violence, he would need to be ready to protect himself and the tourists around him. Marcus put his phone back in his pocket and stepped even closer to the guard. The smell of alcohol was overwhelming now, and his movements were becoming more erratic and unpredictable. He was clearly working himself up to something more than verbal harassment. "You know what I think?" Marcus said, his voice getting louder and more slurred. "I think you're not a real soldier at all. I think you're just some actor they hire to stand here and look pretty for the tourists. Because a real soldier would have done something by now." Marcus reached out his hand as if to touch the guard's rifle, but stopped just short when he noticed James's grip subtly tighten on the weapon. For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus saw a tiny sign that the guard was not as passive as he appeared to be. This small reaction seemed to encourage Marcus rather than warn him away. In his alcohol-clouded judgment, he interpreted it as a sign that he was finally getting under the guard's skin. He had no way of knowing that what he was seeing was not fear or weakness, but the controlled preparation of a trained soldier who was ready to defend himself if necessary. "Oh, now you're paying attention," Marcus taunted. "I knew you weren't as tough as you pretend to be. Just another fake soldier boy." The tension in the air was now thick enough to cut with a knife. Tourists were pulling their children away from the area while others continued filming, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Security cameras mounted on the palace walls were capturing every moment, and palace security was already on their way to intervene. Marcus made one final verbal assault before crossing the line that would change everything. "You know what? I don't think you've got what it takes to be a real soldier. Matter of fact, I think you're nothing but a coward hiding behind that uniform." The words hung in the air like a challenge that could not be ignored. Marcus had pushed the situation to its breaking point, and everyone present could sense that something was about to happen. James continued to stand perfectly still, but his military training was now fully engaged, and he was ready for whatever came next. What Marcus didn't realize was that he was not facing some ceremonial figure or tourist attraction. He was confronting a highly trained soldier who had survived combat in Afghanistan, someone who had been taught to remain calm under extreme pressure and to respond with precise, devastating force when necessary. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Marcus a lesson he would never forget and provide the watching crowd with a demonstration of what real military training looked like when pushed to its limits. In a matter of seconds, Marcus's world was about to be turned completely upside down. Marcus Thompson had spent his entire adult life believing that aggression and intimidation were the keys to respect. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Birmingham, he had learned early that the loudest voice and the strongest fist usually won the argument. His reputation as someone you didn't want to cross had served him well in construction sites and pub fights, but standing in front of Buckingham Palace, he was about to discover that his usual tactics were not only ineffective but potentially dangerous. The alcohol coursing through Marcus's system had dulled his ability to read the situation accurately. What he saw as the guard's weakness was actually something far more dangerous: the controlled patience of a professional soldier. James Mitchell had spent years learning to manage his emotions under extreme pressure, whether facing enemy fire in Afghanistan or dealing with difficult situations during his royal duties. Every fiber of his being was trained to remain calm until action was absolutely necessary. Marcus stepped back slightly and began addressing the crowd that had gathered around them. By now, nearly 50 tourists and passersby had stopped to watch the confrontation, their phones recording every moment. Marcus seemed to feed off their attention, his ego swelling with each pair of eyes focused on him. "Everyone see this," Marcus called out, gesturing toward James. "This is what passes for British military these days. Pretty boys in fancy costumes who can't even defend themselves when a real man challenges them." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Among them was Robert Shun, a veteran who had served in the Royal Navy for 12 years before retiring to work as a tour guide in London. Robert recognized something in James's posture that Marcus completely missed. The guard's stillness wasn't passive. It was the controlled readiness of someone waiting for the right moment to act. Sarah continued, pleading with her boyfriend to leave the situation alone. "Marcus, you've made your point. Everyone can see you're not afraid of him. Let's just go get some lunch and enjoy our day." But Marcus was far beyond listening to reason. The combination of alcohol, adrenaline, and the attention of the crowd had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. He turned back to James and began making exaggerated movements, mimicking what he thought was a military stance. "Look at me, I'm a Queen's Guard," Marcus announced mockingly, straightening his posture in a crude imitation of James's perfect military bearing. "I stand here all day like a mannequin because I'm too scared to do anything else." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some tourists were clearly uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior and began moving away, while others seemed entertained by what they perceived as harmless fun. A group of teenage boys had positioned themselves to get the best video angles, hoping to capture something they could post online for viral fame. James remained perfectly still, but his peripheral vision was tracking everything happening around him. He was aware of the crowd's positioning, the location of potential obstacles, and, most importantly, Marcus's increasing agitation. His military training had taught him to constantly assess threats and prepare for multiple scenarios simultaneously. Marcus decided to escalate his performance even further. He began marching back and forth in front of James, attempting to mimic the precise movements of a military drill. His execution was sloppy and exaggerated, clearly designed to mock rather than demonstrate any real understanding of military discipline. "This is how they train them," Marcus announced to his audience. "March around in circles, stand perfectly still, and never think for yourself." No wonder they lost the empire. The historical ignorance of his statement was lost on Marcus, but several people in the crowd exchanged glances that suggested they were becoming less amused and more concerned about his behavior. The situation was clearly moving beyond harmless tourist antics into something more serious. Robert Chun decided to intervene before things went too far. He stepped forward from the crowd and addressed Marcus in a calm but firm voice. "Mate, I think you had your fun. Why don't you let the guard do his job and move along?" Marcus turned toward Robert with the aggressive swagger that had intimidated countless people before. "And who are you supposed to be? Another one of the Queen's lapdogs?" Robert maintained his calm demeanor despite Marcus's obvious attempt to provoke him. "I'm just someone who recognizes that this man is doing his duty and deserves to be left alone." This intervention seemed to infuriate Marcus even more. In his alcohol-impaired mind, Robert's calm response was another sign of weakness, another example of people who were too cowardly to stand up to him. He had no way of knowing that Robert had spent years serving on naval vessels where discipline and respect for duty were matters of life and death. "Duty?" Marcus laughed harshly, standing there like a statue while real men are out working for a living. "That's not duty, that's a joke." Robert decided not to engage further. recognizing that Marcus was beyond reason. Instead, he positioned himself where he could intervene if the situation became physical, while quietly encouraging other tourists to give the confrontation more space. Marcus interpreted Robert's withdrawal as a victory and turned his attention back to James with renewed confidence. The guard's continued silence was no longer just frustrating to Marcus. It was becoming personally insulting. In his worldview, a man who wouldn't respond to direct provocation was either a coward or was looking down on him, and either interpretation was unacceptable. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Marcus said, stepping closer to James again. "Standing there in your fancy uniform, looking down on working people like me. Well, let me tell you something, toy soldier. I've worked for everything I've got. I've earned my respect with these hands." Marcus held up his fists, which were indeed scarred and calloused from years of construction work and fighting. What he didn't realize was that James's hands, hidden beneath his white gloves, bore different kinds of scars from different kinds of work. Scars from handling weapons under combat conditions, from training exercises that pushed physical and mental limits, and from the kind of disciplined preparation that Marcus had never experienced. The crowd was now noticeably tense. Several families with children had moved well away from the confrontation, while others continued filming with a mixture of fascination and growing concern. A few people had their phones ready to call for help if things escalated further. Marcus began walking in a circle around James, like a predator stalking prey. His movements were becoming more erratic and threatening as the alcohol continued to affect his judgment and coordination. Each circuit brought him closer to the guard, testing boundaries and looking for any sign of reaction. "I bet you've never been in a real fight." Marcus continued his verbal assault. "I bet the closest you've come to danger is getting a paper cut from your deployment orders. Me? I've been fighting since I was 12 years old. Street fights, bar fights, construction site fights. I've never lost, and I'm not about to start with some dressed-up toy soldier." James's breathing remained steady and controlled, but he was now fully engaged in threat assessment mode. His peripheral vision tracked Marcus's movements while his mind calculated distances, angles, and potential responses. Years of military training had taught him to remain calm while simultaneously preparing for rapid action if necessary. Marcus stopped directly in front of James again, this time positioning himself so close that their faces were only inches apart. The guard could smell not just alcohol, but the sweat and aggression radiating from Marcus's body. Still, James remained perfectly motionless, his eyes focused straight ahead as if Marcus didn't exist. This complete lack of acknowledgement was the final straw for Marcus's already fragile ego. In his experience, even the toughest opponents showed some reaction when confronted this directly. The guard's ability to remain completely unaffected was something outside Marcus's understanding, and it filled him with a rage that overrode any remaining common sense. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls and causing tourists throughout the area to turn and stare. "I'm standing right here. I'm talking to you. The least you can do is acknowledge that I exist." But James continued staring straight ahead, his discipline absolute and his focus unwavering. He had been trained to ignore distractions, threats, and provocations that were far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything Marcus could devise. Taliban fighters had tried to break his concentration with gunfire and explosives. A drunk tourist with verbal taunts was hardly a significant challenge. Marcus's frustration reached a boiling point. He had exhausted his repertoire of intimidation tactics without getting even the slightest reaction. In his world, this level of disrespect was intolerable and required a physical response. He began to consider escalating the situation beyond words, not realizing that he was about to cross a line that would change everything. The crowd sensed the shift in Marcus's demeanor. Those who had been entertained by his earlier antics now recognized that something more serious was developing. Parents pulled their children further away, while others positioned themselves to capture what they suspected might be about to happen. Robert Chun, still watching from the edge of the crowd, recognized the dangerous signs and quietly moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary. His military experience told him that Marcus was approaching the point where alcohol, ego, and frustration would override whatever common sense he might have left. Marcus raised his hand as if to poke James in the chest, then stopped just short of actual contact. He was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before getting a reaction. In his mind, he was demonstrating his dominance over someone who was clearly too weak or scared to defend himself. "What's the matter?" Marcus taunted. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to talk to a real man?" The irony of the situation was completely lost on Marcus. In his effort to demonstrate his superiority over someone he perceived as weak, he was actually revealing his own insecurity and need for validation. James, meanwhile, was displaying the kind of genuine strength that comes from discipline, training, and confidence in one's abilities. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach everyone present a lesson about the difference between true strength and mere aggression. Marcus was about to learn that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who never feel the need to prove their toughness to anyone. The tension outside Buckingham Palace had reached a critical point. Marcus Thompson stood inches from Guardsman James Mitchell, his face flushed with alcohol and rage, completely unaware that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The crowd of tourists had grown to nearly 70 people, all sensing that something significant was about to happen. Phones were raised, fingers hovering over emergency call buttons, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Marcus had spent the last 15 minutes escalating his verbal assault, growing increasingly frustrated by James's absolute refusal to acknowledge his presence. In Marcus's limited worldview, this level of disrespect was intolerable. He had built his entire identity around being the toughest person in the room, the man everyone else feared and respected. But here was someone who seemed completely unimpressed by his threats and intimidation. James Mitchell, for his part, was experiencing a level of mental clarity that only comes from years of military training under extreme pressure. Every muscle in his body was relaxed, yet ready. His breathing was controlled and steady, and his mind was processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. He was aware of Marcus's positioning, the crowd's location, potential escape routes, and the precise distance to his rifle. Most importantly, he was monitoring Marcus's escalating aggression and preparing for the moment when words might turn to violence. The breaking point came when Marcus made a decision that would change everything. His alcohol-impaired judgment convinced him that the only way to get a reaction from the guard was to make the situation physical. He had threatened, insulted, and mocked without getting any response. Now it was time to see what this toy soldier would do when actually touched. Marcus reached out and jabbed his finger hard into James's chest, right at the center of his red tunic. "I'm talking to you," he shouted. "The least you can do is look at me when I'm addressing you." The moment Marcus's finger made contact with James's uniform, several things happened almost simultaneously. First, James's training kicked in automatically. Any physical contact while on guard duty was considered a potential assault, and he was authorized to respond accordingly. Second, the crowd collectively gasped, recognizing that the situation had just crossed from harassment into something much more serious. Third, security cameras throughout the palace grounds focused on the developing situation, and palace security began moving toward the scene. But Marcus wasn't finished. The fact that his physical contact had still failed to get a visible reaction from James only fueled his rage further. In his twisted logic, he interpreted the guard's continued silence as proof that he was dealing with someone too weak or scared to fight back. This was exactly the kind of situation where Marcus thrived, where he could demonstrate his dominance over someone who couldn't or wouldn't defend themselves. "What's wrong with you?" Marcus demanded, jabbing James in the chest again, harder this time. "Are you deaf? Are you stupid? Or are you just too much of a coward to even acknowledge that I'm here?" Sarah was now crying openly, tugging at Marcus's arm and begging him to stop. "Please, Marcus, you're scaring me. Let's just leave. We can go somewhere else, do something fun." Please don't do this. But Marcus shrugged off her grip with an angry gesture that nearly knocked her to the ground. His attention was completely focused on the guard who continued to stand perfectly still despite being physically assaulted. In Marcus's experience, even the toughest opponents showed some reaction when you put your hands on them. This complete lack of response was something outside his understanding. Robert Chun, the Navy veteran who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, recognized the dangerous trajectory of the situation. He knew from his military experience that guards like James were trained to endure significant provocation, but they were also trained to respond with overwhelming force when that provocation crossed certain lines. Marcus had no idea how close he was to triggering a response that would end very badly for him. "Mate, you need to stop right now," Robert called out, stepping forward again despite Marcus's earlier aggression toward him. "You don't know what you're dealing with here." Marcus turned toward Robert with a snarl. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. A scared little boy playing dress-up soldier. And apparently his boyfriend wants to help him out." The crowd was now completely silent except for the sound of Marcus's increasingly loud and slurred speech. Even the most entertained tourists had recognized that this was no longer funny or harmless. Children were being pulled away by their parents, and several people had their phones ready to call for emergency services. Marcus turned back to James and decided to escalate even further. He placed both hands on the guard's chest and pushed, trying to force some kind of reaction. "Move," he demanded. "Do something. Fight back. Or are you just going to stand there like a statue forever?" James remained perfectly still, absorbing the physical contact without any visible reaction. But inside his mind, he was now in full combat mode. His training had taught him to endure significant provocation while on ceremonial duty, but there were limits to what he was required to tolerate. Physical assault was one of those limits, and Marcus had now crossed it multiple times. The guard's seeming passivity only encouraged Marcus to push further. In his alcohol-clouded reasoning, he had found someone who was too weak to defend themselves, which made them the perfect target for demonstrating his dominance. He had no way of knowing that what he interpreted as weakness was actually the controlled restraint of someone capable of ending the confrontation in seconds. Marcus stepped back and began addressing the crowd again, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "Everyone see this? This is what the British military has become. Pretty boys in fancy uniforms who won't even defend themselves when a real man challenges them." He gestured dramatically toward James, playing to his audience like a performer on stage. "I could do anything I want to this guy, and he won't do nothing about it, because he knows I'm tougher than him. Because he knows he can't handle a real fight with someone like me." The irony of Marcus's statements was lost on him completely. He was interpreting James's professional discipline and training as cowardice, not realizing that he was actually facing someone whose military experience included surviving combat situations that would have terrified Marcus into complete paralysis. A few people in the crowd began moving away more urgently, sensing that Marcus's behavior was escalating toward violence. Others remained transfixed, their phones recording every moment of what they suspected might become a significant incident. The contrast between their growing unease and Marcus's increasing confidence was stark. Marcus decided to make his final demonstration of dominance. He walked up to James and placed his face inches from the guards, staring directly into his eyes. "Last chance, soldier boy. You can either acknowledge that I'm standing here talking to you, or I'm going to make you acknowledge me." For the first time since the confrontation began, James's eyes shifted slightly to meet Marcus's gaze. It was just a tiny movement, barely perceptible to the watching crowd, but Marcus saw it and interpreted it as a sign that he was finally breaking through the guard's composure. "There we go," Marcus said with a cruel smile. "I knew you were paying attention. I knew you could hear everything I was saying. So why don't you do the polite thing and respond when someone's talking to you?" But what Marcus saw in James's eyes wasn't fear or submission. It was the cold, calculating assessment of a professional soldier who had just decided that the situation had escalated beyond the point where passive resistance was appropriate. James was no longer just enduring Marcus's harassment. He was preparing to end it. The crowd seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, even if they couldn't identify exactly what had changed. The air felt heavier, more charged with potential violence. Even Marcus, despite his intoxication, felt something different in the way James was looking at him now. But instead of recognizing this as a warning, Marcus interpreted it as encouragement. In his mind, he had finally gotten under the guard's skin and was about to prove his dominance once and for all. He had no idea that what he was seeing was not weakness finally revealed, but strength finally unleashed. Marcus made his final mistake by reaching out to grab James's rifle. "Let's see how tough you are without your little toy gun," he said, his hand closing around the weapon's barrel. The moment Marcus's hand touched the rifle, James knew that the situation had moved beyond harassment into direct assault on a member of the military while on duty. This was no longer about enduring provocation. This was about defending himself, his weapon, and the security of the palace grounds. In less than a second, years of military training, combat experience, and disciplined preparation came together in a single, devastating response that would teach Marcus Thompson a lesson he would never forget. The crowd was about to witness what happened when amateur aggression met professional military skill. The stage was set for a demonstration that would be viewed by millions of people online and become a textbook example of why you should never underestimate someone simply because they choose to remain calm under pressure. The moment Marcus Thompson's hand closed around the barrel of James Mitchell's rifle, time seemed to slow down for everyone present. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed by military experts, and become a defining example of the difference between trained military precision and street-level aggression. James's response was instantaneous and devastating. Years of military training took over, and his body moved with the fluid precision of someone who had practiced these exact motions thousands of times. In one smooth movement, he pulled his rifle back while simultaneously stepping forward and using his shoulder to create space. The motion was so quick and controlled that many people in the crowd initially missed what had happened. Marcus, who had been pulling on the rifle, suddenly found himself off balance as the weapon was yanked away from his grip. His alcohol-impaired reflexes were no match for James's trained movements, and he stumbled backward, windmilling his arms as he tried to regain his footing. But James wasn't finished. His training had taught him that when someone attempts to take your weapon, you don't just retrieve it and wait to see what they do next. You end the threat immediately and completely. As Marcus stumbled backward, James stepped forward and delivered a precise, controlled push to Marcus's chest with his free hand. The push wasn't a wild, emotional shove driven by anger or frustration. It was a calculated application of force designed to neutralize a threat while minimizing unnecessary harm. James had learned these techniques during his military service, where the ability to quickly and efficiently disable an opponent could mean the difference between life and death. Marcus, still off balance from his failed attempt to grab the rifle, was completely unprepared for James's countermovement. The guard's push caught him squarely in the center of his chest, and his already compromised balance gave way completely. His feet went out from under him, and he fell backward with a crash that echoed off the palace walls. The crowd erupted in gasps and exclamations as Marcus hit the ground hard, his back and head striking the pavement with a sound that made everyone wince. Phones that had been recording the verbal confrontation suddenly captured something much more dramatic and significant. Marcus lay on the ground for several seconds, stunned by the speed and effectiveness of what had just happened. His alcohol-clouded mind couldn't process how quickly the situation had changed from him being in control to him being flat on his back on the cold London pavement. The back of his head throbbed where it had struck the ground, and he struggled to understand what had just occurred. James immediately returned to his position of attention, his rifle back at his side, his eyes focused straight ahead as if nothing had happened. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 seconds from the moment Marcus touched the weapon to the moment he hit the ground. To the watching crowd, It seemed almost like magic. One moment Marcus was grabbing for the rifle, and the next he was lying on the pavement looking up at the sky. Sarah rushed to Marcus's side, her tears flowing freely as she knelt beside him. "Oh my God, Marcus! Are you okay? Can you hear me? Please tell me you're not hurt badly." Marcus struggled to sit up, his head spinning from both the alcohol and the impact with the ground. His pride was hurt even more than his body, and the humiliation of being dropped so easily in front of so many people was almost unbearable. He had spent his entire adult life building a reputation as someone not to mess with, and it had been destroyed in seconds by someone he had dismissed as weak. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of shock, awe, and satisfaction. Many people had been uncomfortable with Marcus's aggressive behavior toward the guard, and seeing him receive immediate consequences for his actions felt like justice being served. Others were simply amazed by the speed and precision with which James had handled the situation. Robert Chun, the Navy veteran who had tried to warn Marcus earlier, approached the fallen man with a mixture of concern and vindication. "I try to tell you, mate, these guards aren't ceremonial figures. They're trained soldiers with real military experience." Marcus looked up at Robert with confusion and embarrassment, still struggling to piece together what had happened. "He barely touched me." "How did he?" "Because he knows what he's doing," Robert explained patiently. "You were dealing with someone who has been trained to handle threats quickly and efficiently. You attacked a soldier on duty, and he responded exactly as he was supposed to." Around the crowd, tourists were checking their phone recordings to make sure they had captured the moment. Many of them realized they had just witnessed something that would be shared widely online, and they were excited to be part of viral content that showed such clear consequences for bullying behavior. Marcus slowly got to his feet with Sarah's help, his legs still unsteady from the combination of alcohol and the shock of being put on the ground so effortlessly. His clothes were dirty from the pavement, and he could feel a growing lump on the back of his head where it had struck the ground. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Marcus found himself looking at James with something other than contempt or challenge. There was now a grudging respect mixed with fear and embarrassment. He was beginning to understand that he had severely misjudged his opponent from the very beginning. "I don't understand," Marcus said quietly to Sarah, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "I've been in hundreds of fights. I know how to handle myself. How did he do that so easily?" Sarah helped steady him as he swayed slightly on his feet. "Because you were picking on someone who didn't deserve it, Marcus. And maybe you finally met someone who actually knows how to defend himself properly." The crowd began to disperse slowly, many people continuing to film as they walked away, eager to share their footage of the incident. Others lingered to make sure Marcus was not seriously injured, though their sympathy was clearly limited given his earlier behavior. James remained perfectly at attention throughout Marcus's recovery, showing no sign of satisfaction, anger, or any other emotion. His expression was as controlled and professional as it had been from the beginning of the confrontation. To him, this had been a simple matter of responding to a threat according to his training, nothing more. Palace security finally arrived on the scene, having been alerted by the multiple emergency calls from tourists. They immediately assessed the situation and began questioning witnesses about what had occurred. The consistent reports from multiple sources painted a clear picture of Marcus as the aggressor who had escalated the situation to physical assault. Marcus found himself facing the possibility of serious legal consequences for his actions. Assaulting a member of the Royal Guard while on duty was not just a simple assault charge. It was a matter of national security that could result in significant fines and imprisonment. "Sir," one of the security officers said to Marcus, "we're going to need you to come with us for questioning regarding your assault on the Queen's Guard." The word assault hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his mind, he had been the victim of an unprovoked attack by an overly aggressive soldier. He couldn't understand how his actions were being characterized as assault when all he had done was try to get the guard's attention. "Assault," Marcus protested, his voice still slurred from alcohol. "He's the one who attacked me. I was just trying to talk to him, and he threw me to the ground." The security officer looked at Marcus with the patience of someone who had dealt with similar situations many times before. "Sir, multiple witnesses report that you physically contacted the guard first, and that you attempted to grab his rifle. That constitutes assault on a military member while on duty." As the reality of his situation began to sink in, Marcus felt his earlier confidence and aggression drain away completely. The alcohol was wearing off, his head was pounding, his pride was shattered, and he was now facing legal consequences that could affect the rest of his life. Sarah stood beside him, no longer crying, but looking deeply disappointed and embarrassed by her boyfriend's behavior. She had warned him repeatedly to leave the guard alone, and now they were both facing the consequences of his refusal to listen. The crowd continued to thin out, but many people remained to give statements to security about what they had witnessed. The overwhelming consensus was that Marcus had been the clear aggressor throughout the encounter, and that James had shown remarkable restraint before finally responding to defend himself and his weapon. As Marcus was led away for questioning, he kept looking back at James, who remained perfectly at his post as if nothing had happened. The contrast between the guard's continued composure and Marcus's disheveled, defeated appearance was stark and meaningful. The incident was already beginning to spread across social media platforms, with multiple videos showing different angles of Marcus's verbal harassment, followed by his swift and decisive takedown. The hashtags #BullyMeetsGuard and #InstantJustice began trending as people shared their reactions to seeing such clear consequences for aggressive behavior. For Marcus Thompson, this Tuesday morning in London had started as an opportunity to show off and impress his girlfriend. It was ending as the most humbling experience of his life, one that would follow him online forever and teach him a lesson about respect, restraint, and the dangers of underestimating people who choose to remain calm under pressure. The aftermath of Marcus Thompson's confrontation with the Queen's Guard spread far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. Within hours, videos of the incident have been uploaded to every major social media platform, viewed millions of times, and sparked conversations around the world about respect, military training, and the consequences of bullying behavior. Marcus found himself in a small, sterile interview room at a nearby police station, nursing a cup of coffee and a growing headache that was only partly due to his collision with the pavement. The alcohol had worn off completely now, leaving him with crystal-clear memories of his humiliating defeat and growing awareness of the legal trouble he was facing. Detective Inspector Helen Davies sat across from him, reviewing witness statements and video evidence collected from the scene. She had seen plenty of similar cases over her 15 years with the Metropolitan Police, but the sheer amount of video documentation made this one particularly straightforward. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "I want to make sure you understand the seriousness of what occurred today. You physically assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Guard while he was on duty. This isn't a simple case of a tourist getting a bit rowdy. This is a matter of national security." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the reality of his situation finally beginning to penetrate through his earlier bravado. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted him to acknowledge me. I didn't think touching his uniform was such a big deal." Detective Inspector Davies pulled out her tablet and showed Marcus one of the clearer videos of the incident. This footage shows you jabbing the guard in the chest multiple times, then grabbing his rifle. In what world is that not assault? Watching the video was excruciating for Marcus. Seeing himself from the outside, slurring his words, and becoming increasingly aggressive while the guard remained perfectly composed, made him realize how he must have appeared to everyone present. The person in the video looked like a drunken bully picking on someone who was just trying to do his job. "I was drunk," Marcus said quietly, as if this explanation would somehow excuse his behavior. "I wasn't thinking clearly. I make stupid decisions when I've been drinking." "That may be true, Mr. Thompson, but it doesn't change what you did or absolve you of responsibility for your actions," the detective replied firmly. The guard showed remarkable restraint in dealing with your harassment. Many people in his position would have responded much sooner and with greater force. Meanwhile, At Buckingham Palace, James Mitchell had completed his shift and was being debriefed by his commanding officers about the incident. For him, the confrontation had been a straightforward application of his training. Nothing more, nothing less. "You handled that perfectly, Mitchell," said Captain Robert Ashford, reviewing the security footage with his sergeant. "You showed exceptional restraint and only responded when the situation escalated to actual assault. Your response was measured, appropriate, and professional." James nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement, but not feeling particularly proud or satisfied. In his mind, he had simply done his job according to his training. The fact that Marcus had been so easily neutralized wasn't something to celebrate. It was simply the natural result of professional military training meeting amateur aggression. "The video has already gone viral," Captain Ashford continued. "Millions of people have seen footage of the incident, and the response has been overwhelmingly positive. People are praising your restraint and professionalism." James found this information interesting, but not particularly meaningful. He hadn't acted for public approval or viral fame. He had responded to a threat according to his training. The public's reaction was irrelevant to the professional standards he held himself to. Back at the police station, Marcus was learning about the potential consequences of his actions. Detective Inspector Davies explained that he could face charges of assault, drunk and disorderly conduct, and threatening behavior. If convicted on all charges, he could face significant fines and up to 6 months in prison. 6 months. Marcus's voice cracked slightly as the weight of his situation hit him fully. For touching someone's uniform, for assaulting a soldier on duty, and attempting to take his weapon, the detective corrected. The fact that the guard's response was so controlled actually worked in your favor. If you had tried this with someone less professional, you might be facing much more serious charges. Sarah was waiting in the lobby when Marcus was finally released on bail several hours later. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was one of disappointment rather than sympathy. The drive back to their hotel was conducted in complete silence, both of them processing the day's events in their own way. The video footage of the incident continued to spread across the internet throughout the evening. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as an example of military professionalism and the consequences of bullying behavior. The consensus among viewers was that Marcus had gotten exactly what he deserved. The comments on social media were particularly harsh. "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes," wrote one user. "This is what happens when you mess with a real soldier," commented another. "Perfect example of why you should treat people with respect," added a third. Marcus spent the evening reading these comments on his phone, watching his public humiliation being shared and celebrated by millions of strangers. The person in the videos seemed like someone else to him now, a drunk, aggressive bully who had deserved everything he got. But he was slowly beginning to accept that this person was him. The legal process continued over the following weeks. Marcus was fortunate that James and his commanding officers recommended leniency, citing Marcus's obvious intoxication and the fact that no one had been seriously injured. The judge ultimately sentenced him to community service, a substantial fine, and mandatory anger management counseling. The community service was particularly meaningful for Marcus. He was assigned to work with a veteran support organization, helping former soldiers transition back to civilian life. Working alongside men and women who had served their country with honor gave him a new perspective on what real strength and courage looked like. One of the veterans he worked with was David Walsh, a former Royal Marine who had lost his leg in Afghanistan. David had heard about Marcus's incident at the palace and was curious about the man who had become internet famous for all the wrong reasons. "What made you think it was okay to harass a guard like that?" David asked during one of their work sessions, his tone more curious than accusatory. Marcus had been asking himself the same question for weeks. "I honestly don't know," he replied. "I guess I thought he was weak because he wouldn't react to me. I thought standing still meant he was scared or couldn't defend himself." David laughed, but not unkindly. "Mate, the ability to stay calm under pressure is one of the hardest things to learn in military training. That guard wasn't standing still because he was weak. He was standing still because he was strong enough to control himself until action was absolutely necessary. This conversation was a turning point for Marcus. He began to understand that what he had interpreted as weakness was actually a form of strength that he had never experienced or understood. The guard's calm professionalism wasn't cowardice. It was the ultimate expression of self-control and discipline. The anger management counseling also helped Marcus examine the deeper issues behind his aggressive behavior. He learned that his need to dominate and intimidate others came from his own insecurities and feelings of inadequacy. The therapist helped him understand that true confidence didn't require putting others down or proving himself through aggression. Sarah initially stayed with Marcus through his legal troubles and community service, but their relationship never recovered from the incident. She had been embarrassed and frightened by his behavior that day, and watching him spiral into aggression had made her realize that this wasn't the kind of person she wanted to build a future with. They broke up amicably 6 months later. James Mitchell continued his duties at Buckingham Palace, largely unaffected by his brief internet fame. He appreciated the support from the public, but remained focused on his professional responsibilities. The incident with Marcus had been handled exactly as his training dictated, and he saw no reason to dwell on it or seek attention from it. The video of Marcus's takedown continued to circulate online for months, becoming a classic example of instant justice content that people shared when discussing bullying, respect, and consequences. It was used in military training presentations as an example of proper restraint and appropriate response to civilian aggression. For Marcus, the incident became a catalyst for significant personal change. The community service, counseling, and public humiliation forced him to confront aspects of his personality that he had never examined before. He gradually learned to channel his energy into positive pursuits rather than aggression and intimidation. 2 years after the incident, Marcus had completed his community service, finished his anger management program, and begun working as a mentor for young men struggling with similar anger issues. He used his own story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked aggression and the importance of treating others with respect. He never forgot the lesson learned outside Buckingham Palace, that true strength isn't about being the loudest or most aggressive person in the room. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who remain calm, controlled, and professional even when faced with provocation. It was a lesson that changed not just how he behaved, but how he understood himself and his place in the world. The incident at Buckingham Palace became more than just a viral video or a humiliating defeat for a bully. It became a teaching moment watched by millions, demonstrating that respect is earned through character and conduct, not through intimidation and aggression. For everyone who watched the footage, it served as a reminder that professional training, discipline, and genuine strength will always triumph over amateur bluster and borrowed courage from a bottle. James Mitchell never knew about Marcus's transformation or the positive changes that resulted from their brief encounter. He continued his duties with the same professionalism and dedication that had made him an exemplary guard, secure in the knowledge that he had handled a difficult situation exactly as he had been trained to do. For him, it was simply another day at work, another challenge met, and overcome with military precision and professional conduct.